Got one more before we do artificial intelligence. I am a real person. I am not ChatGPT. My name's Rob Maines. I'm a writer for Baseball Prospectus, and I'm going to talk today about an anniversary. It's 50 years ago this season, the American League stopped having its pitchers bat in games. So happy anniversary to those who celebrate. When the designated hitter came into force in 1973, of course, it was controversial. We all remember the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes admonition that the First Amendment does not give you the right to shout DH in a crowded SABR convention. But by now, it's pretty much settled law. We have permanently the DH in both leagues. Pitchers no longer bat. And so what I thought I'd do today is give us kind of an aerial view of what we're missing by not having pitchers hitting. Okay, this, by contrast, is a Times New Roman view. Get it? That's Arial and Times New Roman. Got font humor here. Okay, this is the sixth game, or the fifth game, sorry, of the 2021 World Series, top of the ninth. Houston's up 9-5, and Kendall Graveman had just pitched a hitless, or not a hitless, but he pitched a shutout eighth inning, and the Astros leading 9-5. Next day was going to be a day off. Games in Atlanta, so there's no DH. Dusty Baker elected to keep Graveman in the game to pitch the ninth because it said next day was going to be next day was day off. So what you can see is there were two outs, and Kendall Graveman came up to bat. First two pitches were strikes by Smiley. He missed on the next three, almost lost the batter, but you can see punched him out the next pitch with a cutter. Two interesting things about this plate appearance. First one, under the old rules, that is, other than Ohtani rules, or when a DH gets taken out of the game because he moves to a position, this is the last time in MLB history that a pitcher hit for himself the way that we're used to seeing for all those years. Second thing, he didn't really need to bring his bat to the plate. All Graveman did, he walked to the plate, held his bat up, watched six pitches go by, half of them strikes, and walked back to the dugout. That's the way pitchers hitting ended, not with a bang, but with a called strikeout where the batter didn't even swing. So why aren't there pitchers hitting in the majors anymore? You're going to know all of this stuff. 1972 American League. Position players had a pretty lousy year with a 671 OPS, and owners were concerned that this was causing a decline in interest in the game. Not enough offense. Fans weren't going to show up at the ballpark. They weren't going to watch games and listen on radio. So advertising rates were going to go down. Had to do something because that 671 OPS was actually for the whole league 22 points lower. The reason for that is that you had all these pitchers who were wretched hitters taking up place in the lineup, bringing down the league-wide averages. Somewhat similarly, in 2021, the National League, offense was not at the level it had been previously, though obviously a lot better than it had been in 72 in the American League. But like 72 in the American League, the OPS for the whole league was dragged down 21 points from where it was for position players. The reason is, even though they batted a lot less, you still had pitchers in the lineup, and they were horrible. They were way worse than they were in the American League in 72. How much worse? This graph I'm showing you is the divisional play area since 69. Every graph or table I show you is going to exclude 2020. The right y-axis is the percentage of plate appearances by pitchers that ended in strikeouts. And what you can see is that pitchers always struck out a lot, but especially over the last 10 years, it just got out of control. To the last year that they batted, 2021, 4 of 9 pitcher plate appearances ended with a punch out. I think even more dramatically, though, if you look at the left axis, that's OPS plus. That's a statistic that Baseball Reference gives us. It shows OPS adjusted for park effects and for league effects, and it's scaled to a 100 as league average. And you can see the scale's only going up to 25. So we're starting with some really bad hitters. But again, over the last 10 years, it got a lot worse. In 2011, the OPS plus for pitchers dropped below zero and stayed there every subsequent year, hitting an all-time low of -19 in 2021. That's essentially saying that National League pitchers managed to break OPS. plus. It was like 119% worse than average. So what happens when you implement the DH? I'm going to blow through this. 1973, offense was up overall in the majors, but on every hitting metric, it was up more in the American League, substantially more than it was in the National League. By the way, when I was preparing this, I was looking up something about PowerPoint, and somebody said for effective PowerPoints, don't do a lot of animations. I'm sorry, I completely ignored them. Okay, 22 was a little bit different. 22 was a down year for offense overall. But again, what we saw was in the National League, the hit that National League aggregate stats took was less than the hit that they did in the American League, though oddly for strikeouts and walks, though the differences were smaller, the difference being that pitchers weren't in the lineup. Okay, so if you take pitchers out of the lineup, offense is better. This is the cutting edge research you all came here to hear. What else happened with scoring, though? This graph shows the pattern of scoring by inning in the National League in 2021 while pitchers still batted. And this, if you look back in baseball history, this is pretty typical. You get the most runs in the first inning because you've got your lineup. If it's a well-constructed lineup, optimized, you get the fewest runs in the second inning because you got the bottom of the lineup, possibly the pitcher hitting, and then the subsequent innings are somewhere in between. The only wrinkle in 2021 is there's a little boost in the eighth inning from tie doubleheaders. There were only 7 innings then. You had a boost from the zombie runner in the eighth. But generally, this is a pattern you'd expect to see almost any year that pitchers hit. In 2022, when pitchers were out of the lineup, and again, offense was down that year. So it's not that the first inning became, less important. It's that the middle innings rose in prominence. The distribution of runs when you take the pitcher out of the lineup is much more even, and the top scoring innings become the middle innings because you've got a pitcher facing the opposing order the second or third time. He's not going to be facing a pitcher, and so you see more offense. Now, the question is this an anomaly or is this what we'd expect to see? Well, here's the 2 National League years, and what I've superimposed here with dotted lines is the American League for those seasons. And the American League in 2021, the top scoring inning was the third inning, the second was the fifth, not the first inning. 2022, it was noisy, but fifth inning had the most runs, third inning had the second most. It wasn't the first inning. You take pitchers out of the lineup, the distribution of runs over the 9 innings becomes much more even. One bonus is that if you always have to face a lot of traffic getting in the ballpark, you're not going to miss most of the runs if you get there after the first inning. And the second is, since there's more scoring in the middle innings, there's more of an opportunity to come back from a first inning deficit. 2021, National League teams leading after 1 inning won 73% of their games. It dropped to 71% the following year. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about sacrifices. Obviously, if you take pitchers out of the lineup, you're going to get a lot fewer sacrifice bunts. 2021, 76% of all sacrifices in the National League were by pitchers. 2022, no more pitchers batting. The number of sacrifices plummeted. There were fewer bunts in the National League than in the American League, and the 6 teams with the fewest sacrifice hits were all National League teams. But here's the little wrinkle. I said that 76% of bunts in 2021 were by pitchers. Sacrifices fell only 66% in the league. So somebody else was bunting more. Turns out it was some position players. This graph shows number of plate appearances per sacrifice hit in the National League just for position players. And since the higher that number is, the fewer sacrifice bunts there are going to be, I reverse the scale. And what you can see is that there weren't a lot of sacrifice bunts by position players to start out with, but beginning again about 10 years ago, that number began to plummet, but it's rebounded in the last couple of years. Now, it's not like we're seeing a renaissance of position players bunting. 2022, the rate was the 4th lowest in all of National League history for position players bunting, but there were a few more. And when you think about it, there are times that a sacrifice bunt can make sense if you're playing for just 1 run and you have a particularly weak hitter at the plate. That weak hitter in National League lineups is no longer the pitcher, it's somebody else. The 3 National League batters with most sacrifice bunts last year were Tomas Nido, I'm forgetting the third. It'll come to me. And Victor Robles. Perdomo was the second. They had the three most sacrifice bunts in the National League. None of them have an OPS over 600. So in a way, poor hitting position players are the new pitchers from a bunting perspective a little bit. Now, when people complain about the DH, it's not because of what it does to scoring, it's what it does to strategy. Specifically, that if you know that you never have to pinch hit for your pitcher, a key decision that managers have to make, they don't have to make anymore. If you're down by a run, you got a pitcher that's cruising, but he's due up the next inning. Are you going to pinch hit for him and take a good pitcher out of the game? Or are you going to let him hit and therefore maybe give up on opportunity to win a ball game? And what we saw in the American League once the DH was implemented is, I think that view was substantiated a little bit. 1972, when offense was down, the average American League starting pitcher lasted 6.6 innings. He continued to last about that through 1976 every year, even though offense was up during that period. So offense was up, but American League pitchers could stick with their starters longer because they didn't have to take them out for a pinch hitter. And what you can see in the National League for those years is there was a decline of about a quarter of an inning per starting pitching appearance. But look what's happened in the years since. As starting pitching length has declined, the trends for the two leagues have largely converged on each other. And what I did in this graph is I looked at American League innings pitched per start minus National League innings pitched per start. So any positive number means American League starters are lasting longer. A negative number means National League starters are lasting longer. And what happened is that leading up to the American League adopting the DH in 1972, National League starters lasted longer in their games. For the next 12 years after we got the DH, American League pitchers lasted longer. I think that suggests that the strategic argument against the DH held water. But I said that in past tense, because if you look at the next 37 years until the National League adopted the DH, in 20 of those years, National League pitchers stayed in the game longer than American League pitchers did. AL pitchers lasted longer, only 17 years. What's happened is that as the strategy for starting pitching has converged on leaving a guy in for 4 or 5 innings or 100 pitches or until he's facing the lineup the third time, the decision to lift a pitcher has become automatic for your starters. It's not a choice that managers have to think about whether to pinch hit. They're going to pinch hit whether the guy's leading, whether the guy's trailing, or the game's tied. Let's look at relief pitchers, because actually in the American League, the impact of the DH was more dramatic there. Relief pitchers in the American League lasted about an inning and a half until the DH was established in 1973. Then it jumped to over 2 innings per outing. And then, as you can see, it's gradually declined. The National League had no such increase. It did have a decline, but you can see is that red line has stayed below the blue line, which is to say that while the two leagues have converged, there's still a tendency for relief pitchers to pitch longer in American League games than in National League games. So maybe that strategic argument against the DH still holds water. This substantiates what you just saw. Every year from the time the AL adopted the DH till the time the NL adopted the DH, there's only one season in which National League relief pitchers lasted longer than American League ones did. But if you look at it from 1998 to present, the 30-team era, the difference is that the average American League outing for a reliever was 4.8 batters faced. The average National League outing was 4.5 batters faced. That's a difference, but it's a difference that amounts to 1 extra batter faced, a little less actually, for every 3 relief pitchers. It's not a big difference. I don't think it's enough to say that American League pitcher managers have an easier job managing their bullpens. Same thing happens with relief pitchers per game. You had a lot fewer of them in American League games initially when you got the DH. Once it's gradually trended up. It's always trended up in the National League. It stayed above the level of the American League. So yeah, National League games have had more relief pitchers than American League games have until the NL adopted the DH. But again, look at the 30-team era. The difference is 0.17 relievers per game, which means that for every 6 games you watch, there's going to be one more reliever in an in a National League game than in an American League game. It's a difference, but I would argue it's a negligible difference. Couple other strategic differences that I don't have charts for, I can just tell you, is that obviously when you take pitchers out of the lineup, the use of pinch hitting plummets. It was down 63% last year in the National League. You don't need as many double switches. They didn't quite vanish, but they became exceptionally rare in the National League. And you might like those strategies, but I would argue that they're both sides of the same strategic coin, in that if the decision to take a pitcher out of a game is one that you have to think about and weigh against keeping him in versus pulling him to maybe score some runs, then yeah, that is part and parcel of a strategic decision. However, what we've seen is when the strategy for starting pitchers is to keep them in for 100 pitches or to face the lineup a couple times and then yank them. The strategy for relievers is leave them in for an inning and then they're gone. It's no longer a strategic decision whether to pinch hit or whether to double switch. It's de rigueur. And so the only question is who you're going to do it with, rather than whether you're going to enact that strategy at all. The last potential impact of removing pitchers from batting is on pitcher health. This logically makes sense. If a pitcher doesn't have to bat, there's no chance he's going to break a finger getting hit by a pitch. If he doesn't have to run the bases, he's not going to pull a hamstring trying to do that. And maybe it's possible that standing out on a base wearing a warm-up jacket fatigues you more than sitting in the dugout, and that, you know, it sets the stage for injuries once you return to the mound. But you can see logically why you might think, no, batting is good for pitcher health. The problem is looking at injury data year to year is tough. We have a lot of injury data on Baseball Prospectus, and there are different rules that affect it between the years. Last year, for instance, rosters were expanded for a while because of the lockout, then they came down. The injured list for pitchers expanded last year from 10 days to 15 days. There were new rules regarding the number of times you could bounce guys up and down from AAA, and so that might affect whether you put some on the IL. And of course, the lockout and the pandemic uniquely affected 2021 and 2022. Nonetheless, I took a look at this. These are non-COVID-19 IL assignments, 2021 versus 2022. Pitchers in 2021, you can see 538 times they were sent to the IL. 2022 is down 10%. The average days that they stayed on was longer, but 10% fewer IL days. That's a good thing. Maybe that's an effect of pitchers not batting. The thing is, batters, their IL days went down 27%. So while I think it's logical to assume that having pitchers no longer bat might have small but meaningful improvement on their health, some guys that aren't going to get injured, there's really nothing in the data from one season that we can point to. So what is the impact of eliminating pitchers hitting? Because I say the DH rule is permanent. It's not going away. First, the impact of scoring. You get more scoring. Right. Second impact, which I think is much more interesting, the pattern of scoring is different. There's a much more even distribution of runs scored over the innings of a ball game. The first inning is no longer where the plurality of runs is scored. You get a lot fewer sacrifices, but a few more position player sacrifices. I think the biggest gripe about the DH, about pitchers no longer batting, had to do with strategy. And I think that those arguments were valid when the DH was first implemented and no longer are. There's no change to pitcher strategy. You can't point to pre-NLDH starting pitcher usage in the NL and starting pitcher usage in the AL and discern any difference. They went the same length. The differences between leagues were random and small. For relievers, you can maybe make an argument that if pitchers don't bat, you get a few more fractions of innings out of them, which means you need a few less fractions of relievers to pitch in games. But I would argue again that the differences are really not statistically significant. Now, the impact on pitcher health, I think logically we can all agree, yeah, if pitchers don't bat, it's probably going to prevent a few injuries. It's just we don't really have the data yet. So before I take questions, I want to make just 3 acknowledgements. One is Baseball Reference and StatHead is where I got almost all the data that you saw today. They are absolutely irreplaceable sources. If you're going to do any of this kind of research, strongly recommend them. Everything I didn't get from BREF and StatHead, I got from my colleagues at Baseball Prospectus. And I'd like to thank SABR and SIS for lining up all these research presentations. I think this is a great part of this panel. And I'd also like to do a plug. I don't have a bullet point that's going to float in for you. For the SABR Analytics Certification Program, I know some of you here are not as familiar with SABR metrics as others. This is a program that SABR sponsors where you can get a self-paced course to familiarize yourself with a lot of these basic concepts. And you can find out more. I recommend it, sabr.org/analytics/certification. And with that, I'm done with my now Trebuchet MS view of pitchers no longer hitting, and I can take any questions.
When you were analyzing changes in reliever usage, did you find any to account for the 3-batter minimum rule change?
Yeah, the question, oh wait, is the mic on? If that mic's on, oh, it's not. Okay, so I'll repeat it for the people watching on video. The question is, did I adjust for the 3-batter minimum rule? I did not, but since that was only a recent change, I figured the data for pretty much every year up to it spoke for itself. Any other questions? Sean.
Sacrifice hits in the last year or 2 due to the zombie runner. I wonder if that was like.
Yeah. Yeah, Sean asks a great question, whether the increase in bunts, really the last couple of years, we saw it rebound because of the zombie runner in extra innings where, that's a research project I want to look at going forward. I think it very well could explain the increase. I don't know whether though it would explain the increase of 22 relative to 21, but certainly 21 over 19. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I now to break out how the pitchers hit in any given year, that in any decade, and so I guess it's part of but that worst of the 20s up until the average. At what point do you say pitchers getting so much on something really you think that the kind of needed to see but at what point do you say that it proves that they don't belong to play at all?
Yeah, the question is when does pitching hitting become so awful that you can't stand anymore? And by the way, if you have StatHead and you do the split finder and you do it over a range of years, looking at something like OPS for pitchers, you can get it right away. And I've done that before. This is just personal opinion. I think that once you're 50% worse than league average, you're considerably worse than just about any position player, other than some off year that some catcher is going to have a horrible 230 at bats. So I think there's an argument for DH long before it was implemented. In fact, if you look through history, there were calls to get pitchers out of the lineup in the 19th century. But I think you could have drawn the line there. I think that what we really needed to get the bats out of pitchers' hands was for owners to feel there is a threat to revenues. Because let's face it, that's what we're all here for, right? Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.